So it was an incredibly rich day with all sorts of things being said on the stage. I think it's typical of these kinds of events to have the participants saying that the most interesting thing happens in the debates that aren't on stage, that happen over lunch or over coffee. And one of the things that came up at lunch today was all of the arguments that were brewing beneath the surface of the presentations that otherwise seemed very convivial and sharing in their interests. So I thought it might be a good idea to try to provoke some of those arguments. So apologies for my effort to be provocative, but I suppose it's in the end really what you are all here for. So I thought maybe a way to do that was to try to make a quick list of the themes and terms, both those stated and those left unstated or checked or repressed, depending on what your position is, and to see what number of terms appear to be shared, but that are actually a mark of difference and perhaps worse, downright conflict. So I'll start with the things that weren't said, terms that you might have expected to be used over the course of a day with the images that we saw. There was a marked absence of the use of the word organic, for example, 5 years ago. I think that would have been a very common term that we would have heard. There was a marked avoidance of the use of the word animal. Although we saw lots of animals, no, you didn't define animality. We saw pictures of animals, although the animal is a big subject of philosophical dispute. Another term that one might have heard or saw the effects of in any case was the notion of the primitive and a certain neo-primitivism that might be said to be emergent amongst some architects. And another term that I think was used, was abused, well, I'm not really quite sure, was the word totality or totalization. We saw some of its cousins in the word unity, in the slightly more distant cousin, continuity, etc. So those are the terms that I was very interested to not hear. Other terms that I did hear, although I think that I heard differentially from one person to another, was the term philosophy. I'm not entirely sure what that meant. I would just go so far as to say that I think in some cases philosophy was being equated simply with language and discourse. I think the distinctions that have been drawn between philosophy and theory could be perhaps teased out. I think that the absence of philosophy was referred to, although we might also say that we saw the work of philosophy doing its work, the work that it has been doing for the last 15 years. Anyway, so philosophy might be a term that we could come back to. Obviously, the word science was oft used and again perhaps inadequately defined, or I don't mean inadequately. I mean if we pushed my fellow panelists into defining the word science, what might have seemed like a point of commonality would probably turn out to be a source of great argument and difference. And of course the term environment was probably the key term that appeared to unite, but most likely provokes a lot of disagreement. In order to pull that all together, I thought that I would just ask at least this afternoon's speakers to talk about a little bit more about the word speculation, to speculate, the speculum, the mirror, etc., because that was also a term that I thought was interesting in its absence and presence. Sanford, you ended, I thought that the ending of your fantastic, always learn so much from Sanford presentation, I thought your ending was very deliberately powerful in the idea that all of this beautification of these people had been done without a mirror. it was essential to you, into your position, I think was the word that you used, that they not have a mirror, because the mirror saved them from narcissism, from representation, from all kinds of things. So the loss of mirror, the lack of mirror, I thought was really the staging of the natural world as you wanted to portray it. I'm going to make a similar comment to my two speakers. I can't help but tell you all, because I already told them, that I really didn't understand quite that, because all of those pictures, for those of you who are readers of the New York Times or in-flight magazines or whatever, all of those pictures have been in such publications, usually in the fashion section. So they may not have been born with a mirror, but now they are certainly part of the trade of mirroring. So anyway, so the status of the mirror, I thought, was something interesting in Sanford's presentation. I'm just going to, without spending so much time, obviously the mirror as a form of speculation, as a form of knowledge, was essential to Patrick's presentation. And finally, in Enrique's, again, in an effort to be as provocative, as politely provocative as possible, I would say that your projects function as mirrors, as reflective representations of what you present as natural events. So they're like diagrams in a science manual. This is how this goes, and so forth, kind of pictures, if you will, of scientific processes. So in each of these three cases, I would say you have very different notions of representation, of what constitutes the natural order, of the effects of science, and so forth. And I'm hoping it will make them argue with each other in order to raise this. I don't know, do I need to, I'm going to turn it over to Sanford and say, I hope I don't need to turn that into a question specifically.
No, in fact, you did our work. We'll all go home now or have a swim. You had a lot of great ideas, actually, as you began going, but it's clear that the mirror is the one that really excited you. And you got me excited by it now. First, let me say the immediate, banal reason I evoked the mirror, and simply because this morning, the first talk, the central question was whether the universe required a mind, or the mind of a human, to mirror it, or whether the universe could act as its own mirror and be coextensive, if you like, with itself. Now, it's an idea to which I have zero interest or tolerance. The next level reason for evoking the mirror at that point was essentially to say that, not that narcissism did not have a role to play in that society and the way those things were playing. These people, by the way, are famously known, besides this kind of dressing up every morning, they're famously also known as the tribe that whip each other to bleed. Okay, that's all I had heard, right? I've heard that basically they whip each other and then they draw blood, and it's really a bloody whole thing. So anyway, a friend of mine dropped in on a helicopter there and shot a bunch of films, and it just so happened it was Sadie Hawkins Day. Now, I don't know how many of you know what Sadie Hawkins Day is. No, I know. I'm going to explain it. No, because it's clearly a profound African ritual. Because Sadie Hawkins Day is something, I don't know, it's some hillbilly tradition the Americans play, where it's the day when the girls get to run after the boys, catch them, and do whatever it is, pair up with them. So, now this is, well, it happens one day of the year, Sadie Hawkins. But what happens in among the Surmi and the Mursi is they have a day where this is where it happens, and they have sticks, and they have this incredibly flirtatious. It turns out when I actually saw the film footage, it's completely flirtatious, completely playful. They're giggling the whole time, and sure, they're drawing blood. But anyway, it's a blood ritual that precedes lovemaking. of one kind or another, when they don't know what kind of lovemaking they do when they're 11, 12, 13, 14 years old. But the issue around it is simply was to say that there is a form of communication here taking place that was both social communication and a form of direct communication with the environment that wasn't mediated through the production of images that would have to do with the way in which the mirror coagulates, if you like, this thing. So the idea simply is that they find their success or failure, they see their beauty as something that they need to find in the eyes of the other, meaning the excitement it produces, if you like, in among their peers. Now, of course, ever since this book was published, there have been questions about what the role actually was of the photographer, whose name is Hans Sylvester, in actually affecting and causing and deforming, if you like, the process. You know, in a sense, was his camera and his delight and the feedback that was happening between him something that was driving the extremism of the makeup and the putting together oneself, et cetera, et cetera. That's a whole issue. I mean, you can get the book, you can read about it. There's been a little bit of issue about it. My interest simply had to do with the imputed, or even, anyway, the imputed innocence involved in whatever could be said to be the primary impetus that allows human and non-human organic, biological landscape continuums to become immersed and, in a certain sense, cross and hybridized with one another. It seems to me that they are essentially reading not only their own eros and not only their own desire, but actually somehow incorporating and extending the fertility and the communicative intensity of the environment itself, that their own bodies do not act in any ways as barriers, but rather as extensions, relays, and continuums for those kinds of things. It struck me that that is what is happening in hunting. I didn't elaborate on the on the incredible literature, basically, on the hunting techniques and hunter-gatherers, etc. But so that was it. I just found it would be something that designers would certainly be interested in. The whole issue of fashion, I'm going to hand this off now, is an interesting one because I don't remember the title of the book, but I think it had fashion in the title. But anyway, I hand off to anyone who wants to pick up on totality. You know, it's very sad that Robin McKay is not here. Oh, Robin, did you choose not to come up? Pardon me? You're fine. Okay. The reason I say it was sad is that we're lacking a whole, we're lacking a necessary component and possibly even a pole in our potential to generate, I think, a discussion around some of the other terms, totality, universals, etc.
I was curious if Sanford noticed the radical challenge which my talk posed to some of your emphases and theses. And again, I think the example of these adornments, you know, isn't the functionalizing and a functionalist account of this the only viable and important account? And isn't that also the way anthropology approaches these issues? And in the next turn, that contemporary fashion, there's a the kind of necessity of adornment for the construction of human society, in parallel to this necessity of architecture of constructing human society, and today, the necessity of evolving and enriching the built environment and architecture. as a necessity of further civilizatory progress, as well as the necessity and functional interpretation of today's fashion system, and design in general as a necessary function system of enhancing communication to levels which we all depend upon for the continuing existence of our civilization. So I think that's the key thing, which also
I'm sorry,
cuts out the brain as the primary protagonist in the story.
Could you just, so that we know how to respond, I
Yeah.
think this is not working. In your first phrase, you said that the functionalism is the only way to view the ornament,
Yep.
and you oppose that to how
Yeah, he's just
understand
enthralled by it, but what is the explanation of its existence and reproduction? Is nature just playing with itself? We forgot about Darwinism, we forgot about the theory of evolution.
But I'm sorry, isn't the functionalist, this is totally decorative, it's my fashion statement. That's what happens to functionalism. But isn't the functionalist, organicist definition of ornament the oldest in architecture? You're saying that as though it were very radical, and so either
No,
mistaken,
no, it
or
is.
I'm
It's-
totally not
I agree
understanding
with
what
you
you're
that
saying.
it is old. That means we're falling back behind insights which Alberti fully articulated, if we don't recognize it.
Well, it works. No, I have to admit, and I'm really, I agree, because I'm French. I agree on your incredible lectures in a way. You convince me, because I'm French. But I'm more German than French, in a way. I try to be more German than French. You are more French than German. It's interesting how you are developing a kind of discourse of the method of Descartes. I really prefer the order of the discourse of Foucault, which is a bit different because you are in the pursuit of the legitimacy of the encyclopedia of Diderot and D'Alembert, trying to define a taxonomy of everything, trying to define a kind of the pursuit of the phantasm in a positive way, phantasm of classification of everything and to adjust a raison d'être of everything.
Yeah.
There is a kind of a raison d'être of everything. But I remember at the same time the research of the Galois about the psychasthenia. You remember this kind of psychasthenia is a research about why some insects are becoming, using a kind of a phasm or stealth or hidden camouflage. And Galois was trying to understand the reason, the raison d'être of this camouflage. Of course, the first raison d'être of the camouflage, the functionalism of the camouflage, is to be hidden against the predator. But if you check the belly of the predator, there is more insects which try to hide themselves than the others. So finally, the insects who are doing a camouflage are more eaten by the predators than the other insects. So the raison d'être of the camouflage is not to hide themselves. It's a high logic, it's a subjective, it's an ornamentation, it's a research of pleasure, it's a research of joy. So in a way, there's kind of the French taxonomy to describe the raison d'être behind any physical aspect or semiological interpretation is becoming bancal, is becoming a sliding oblique. So in a way, there's an interesting battle between historically between German and French. When the French was doing the encyclopedia, and to describe this, it was a big dispute. What kind of word you accept during the encyclopedia, what was accepted or not in the encyclopedia, because the classification is ultimately an order of discourse. An order of discourse means from which legitimacy, who gave me the authority to have the legitimacy to make the taxonomy. Not only to who I'm talking, not only in which condition I'm talking, but from where I hire the power to make this kind of classification. It's interesting, from where you are, I don't know, from where you get the power to do that. But that is typically the D'Alembert research. At the contrary, the German was fighting against this enlightening centuries to develop more a strategy of unknown, a strategy to let the unknown unknown. And to let, and Goethe was developing this kind of, when he talked about the colors research, and the interpretation of Goethe about colors, about the perception as a valuable, not scientific, not chemistry, not physical, but more perceptive. And he was describing something which cannot be described as a research of the asymptotic curve of Leibniz. So perhaps you are becoming more French than me. We are crossing nationality. And I tried myself to be more German, to escape from this kind of rationalism of the discourse, and to escape from this way of, to make taxonomy of everything, in a way, in this tradition of enlightening century, I'm not talking about now. And you are crossing the border in my direction. Well, so we could find perhaps something on the border together.
I mean, for me, it's the importance is to understand the kind of, for instance, the totalizing drive. I could have said totalization, and Marxists have been saying always totalize, always expand beyond the bounds of a kind of knowledge domain and bring in further things. It's only a heuristic principle. And the same I would say, the kind of functional look out for functional explanation is a heuristic principle. It's not a metaphysics. Everything is fully functionalist. Meaning the dispute exists in biology and the philosophy of biology, and it's as well in the dispute, for instance, between Dawkins and Gould in terms of an adaptationism versus an emphasis on the fact that all adaptations are shackled and bound to process of morphogenesis and exaptation and pre-adaptive advances. So there's a kind of tension there, but in terms of the, I think it's enormously fruitful the kind of to privilege functional explanation over causal explanation, to try to ask why are things persisting and reproducing and proliferating, rather than trying to trace the kind of genealogy of influences and what its initial emergence produces. That I think is to a certain extent less powerful and have hazard. And I think also that the functional turn of argument and quest allows you to seek out functional equivalence and push as a design project further.
Wait a minute. You don't forget that when Plato wrote the Parmenid, this kind of discourse between Socrates and Parmenid, he was including the possibility that everything was producing from an essence, from a raison d'être, but except three things. The dust cannot come from a raison d'être. The sweat cannot come from a raison d'être, and the period of woman cannot come from a raison d'être. So it was interesting how finally when you are making classification, you also disqualify. You qualify and disqualify. And me, I'm interested, of course, by Bataille, how the disqualification operates again and again on the surface of things. How you could re-enoblish what was disqualified. And I'm not sure in your classification if you voluntarily put everything, and or if you start to make something which is a kind of hygienic protocol of qualification and disqualification.
It's interesting that your use of the term hygienic, because Sanford, when you were describing, I think I've heard Sanford describe this maybe 10 times, of being in the tree and watching danger unfold nearby. And every time I hear it a little bit differently, but somewhere in the back of my mind there's always the question, why am I hearing this story? And today, in particular, I was thinking to myself, what is the difference between that story and a traditional description of the scientific method, namely acute observation of natural phenomena? So that I started to think today, this is not a story, this is a performance to redefine the scientific method. And okay, but just now I'm realizing it's something else, and this is going to get back to your notion of the functional and also to some of your work. And I'm thinking of Latour and his interest in the laboratory and so forth. And I realized that, for me, this is what I don't know what Sanford was thinking. I never know really what Sanford was thinking. I can only tell you what I was thinking, which was at that moment, the difference between the experiment and the observer began to collapse. So it was a kind of scientific method after the uncertainty principle, in which the distinction between the phenomena taking place, the changes affected on it by observation and so forth. And so then I thought, okay, well, that's not the normal scientific method. That is a very different, that is what I suppose Sanford would describe as a kind of ecological posture assumed by the scientific method. And that becomes a very different way of reading François' work, for example, with the animals in the middle doing kinds of things that mechanical systems normally do and so forth. It's not just the contrast between one order and the other, it's the collapse of a certain kind of distinction between them. And I kept thinking of all of your, gee, I haven't seen those anthropology diagrams in a long time. And when I saw them, I was reminded of one of the Levi-Straussian principles that was taken from all of those village diagrams, which was the distinction between the universal and the customary in the form of the incest taboo. And that for Levi-Strauss, the incest taboo was the original kind of intellectual cultural crisis, because it was the thing that was both the definer of culture. You don't have all human cultures are cultures as opposed to zoos because they have the incest taboo. But on the other hand, they're universal and therefore they belong to the universal system of nature. For Levi-Strauss, the incest taboo, which for me is signed by those anthropological diagrams, is the birth, and I would take it now, the collapse of a certain regime of distinction on the very basic level of the distinction between natural orders and cultural orders. And in the end, Sanford, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that that's why we were looking at those people with their plants, not so much because it was decoration, but because it was an engagement with another order as though there were no incest taboo. So not exactly the lack of mediation, because presumably all of that decor is put on by another person. You can't put on symmetrical plant flower headdress without somebody else doing it for you. But that those things do not appear in the images as crossing the incest taboo. And so I don't know then whether from your point of view, the unifying, totalizing, functionalist argument answers that question, because it displaces on some level the distinction between cultural logic and another logic to just a different day, a different problem. Does that make sense? I mean, I suppose it's an elaborate way of saying, do you believe in the incest taboo? I mean, do you believe that there is still the need to maintain this kind of distinction?
I haven't studied, anthropology in detail, but I feel that my response would here be that most of the incest taboo is an overemphasized symptom. You can only actually institute this. If you have to kind of keep track of who the parents are, who the relatives are, through ordering them through space and this totemism, which you find in all primitive societies. The desperate attempt to construct and maintain distinctions between the sexes, between
kinship
age groups,
relationships,
between clans and sub-clans, in a kind of attempt to build up social complexity, which remains precarious. And you find that described in Durkheim's account on the elemental logic of religion. And I think that's the way I would see it. And incest taboo is just a kind of secondary effect, which actually can only be sustained on the basis of these kind of totemistic practices.
That's extremely interesting. I'm not going to comment just yet on what came to my mind when I was listening to Sylvia, because I think in a certain sense she was setting you up to perhaps better explain your position that you referred, which is clearly your difference from the position I put forward today. Just see, the raw and the cooked essentially serves as a distinction between, let's say, in a way, the natural and the cultural. Now, you went out of your way several times to point out that the cultural represented a threshold beyond which the relations that I was perhaps naively presenting are no longer determinant. That from the point that you reach this level where there becomes cultural activity, and let's say, if I might say so, in the prefrontal cortex, they can actually manage all of that activity. I would say, I don't know where your functionalism argument comes in. I am absolutely not predisposed to accept it, but I don't understand it, so I can't reject it either. But I would say that one of the tendencies, one of the cliches, which of course is universal in evolutionary theory, is that every manifestation, even if it's mimicry, like for example, as you point out, which does not it does not explain itself, as you point out, through the initial explanations. The argument in evolutionary theory is always there is an explanation, and it would be in understanding what type of advantage it bestowed on a particular organism. I don't know if that would be the kind of functionalism. I don't find that, I find that a bit excessive as a thing, but I don't know if that's the kind of functionalism you're talking about. There is a branch in this particular area of paleoanthropology now that is looking at a couple of things which are really central, and they're real mysteries. One derives from Darwin, and that has to do with sexual selection, which seems to follow entirely different rules and logics than the other dominant form of selection through survival of the fittest. The second one has to do with what, in the case of the bowerbirds that everybody hears about and all of the other, is the role of aesthetics. How that functions, if you like, functionalistically, which is what I'm wondering if that's what you were saying.
It's the methodology of anthropology, of sociology, of the social sciences.
What does aesthetics? Because, as far as...
it is fully integrated in the functionalist account.
Well, what do you mean by that? Like, what's an example of that being fully integrated in the functionalist account? What is the functionalist account of aesthetics? What is it? Who is it? I know of Geoffrey Miller's book, for example, and other than that,
aesthetic, let's say, it's a very general dimension of human life and our reactions. For me, it's a kind of condensed, shortcut conditioning of responses. The main advantage is to be super quick, reflex-wise information processing. That's why it needs to be malleable and subject to resolution, but we all navigate a complex environment through aesthetic sensibilities. And, moral sensibilities are a subset of those. And the advantage here is although they're kind of failing rates and you have to readapt if environments and conditions change, the rapidness, the instant gut reaction where you approach what is vital and reject what is kind of harmful, as it were. And that's where we still today navigate the environment, navigate the kind of personnel and communities.
Patrick, we can't hear you because
No.
the microphone's
Sorry, Sean.
Patrick, you work with Zaha Hadid. I just want to ask you something. How do you explain the fascination with shoes?
Okay, we change up.
Women particularly have it.
No, I have a huge
handbags and jewelry.
It's important. I think the fashion system is absolutely vital, and without the fully differentiated and dynamic
This doesn't work anymore.
fashion system. Dynamic.
Use the other one.
Is this one
I think
on?
the other is yes.
This one is?
No.
the performative importance of appearances and aesthetic values. And I have to give this account, otherwise I couldn't justify this investment.
It's interesting, this justification, because there is a kind of, okay, it's coming from digital period where we don't know how to justify why. We are doing a modeling with
How soft is Mike?
micro.
Not working.
No working so well. Okay. No, it's interesting, this kind of post-justification. I think, no, it's not direct critic, but we are coming from a digital period where architects are doing sculpting. Don't kill me. I don't want to, but sculpting without any legitimacy. Finally, you denounce artistic as purely subjectivism, but mainly what appears now in architectures is driven by purely subjectivism or purely temptation of reproduction of the design of the others. It's called not subjectivism, but copyism. But that is another drama. But what I want talking about, there is a kind of illegitimacy now in the field of architectures. Because we don't take you talk about Karl Marx. It's interesting, but we are not using the conflict as a value in architectures. We deny the conflict. We don't take the conflict, the word conflict, which is enormous now. The word troubling is enormous for a lot of reasons, a multitude of reasons, a multiplicity of reasons. But in a way, the architect's field is out of the game of that conflict. For some reason, we could historically perhaps explain that. But don't you think that mathematics is a post-validation? Don't you think that sometimes architects are using mathematics as a post-validation, as a post-justification, to justify the legitimacy of something which is illegitimate in terms of social implication, political implication, urban implication, urban involvement, etc. So it's a kind of gimmick. Hitchcock is using the gimmick possibility. That's overvaluing, trying to embrace a rigor or a reason because there is no reason. I don't know.
But there is not that reason. I
Is
mean,
it? No.
I was thinking
No.
in Patrick, in your presentation, that when you got to the end, you had to fast forward to the world of Zaha Hadid and Patrick Schumacher. And I had a moment of a kind of a sense of betrayal that I thought that what I had sat through was going to get me there. And in fact, I never got there. You just sped through it. So I wonder whether you think that the whole initial, do you think that all of the initial analysis and the positioning of your theory and so forth, is that meant to justify the later work, or is it the later in the sense of the presentation, or is it your own intellectual working through of your life? I mean, I don't mean to ask it like so personal. I don't mean it like, don't tell me your secrets. I don't want to know.
No. I mean, you're absolutely correct to pose this question, because I need to take my own investment seriously. And in a sense, I've been doing that all my life, and I've made choices that sometimes are intuitively drawn to it, but then you need to rationalize and critically corroborate your investments, emotional, aesthetic, intellectual. And yes, absolutely, the theory in the end, and if you look at the theory of architectural autopoiesis, the final chapter of volume 2 is parametricism. It leads to this and substantiate this on many levels. The first in principle, that the styles and these convergence is important and powerful, that it deserves to clear the market, and that it deserves to make a fundamental and profound impact on the physiognomy of the built environment globally, including the world of artifacts. And I'm arguing that, and that means it precisely justifies us in a very profound way. And also this way, it is 100% coherent with my own life investments and practice. And if it wasn't, I would change.
That was a good answer, a good question.
Like Corbusier, he wasn't a time waster. He meant what he said and did what he said.
There's a fundamental different sort of ideological purpose, if you will. I mean, Sanford, there's an incredible generosity to Sanford's every presentation I have. Every presentation I've ever heard Sanford make, some that drove me crazy, some that I agreed with every word. This has nothing to do with loving Sanford on that level. But there's an incredible generosity in the sense that there's a very profound didactic quality to all of them. They're always about giving people information and ways of understanding that he hopes, I think, will persuade them to his position, but you never come away thinking that it's without that kind of sociality in the argument. And in your presentation, there was for me at any rate, there was a very clear, it gave me a strong sense that it was a kind of what a psychoanalyst would call a working through, as something that had to do with your own relationship to your own work and the production of value to you rather than the production of value to someone else. And that's not a question of, that's not better or worse. It's a question for me of trying to understand what the status of the argument is. Because of an argument for you, it's useless to argue with an argument for you about its veracity or its logical coherence. The whole thing has an effect that has to do with a kind of self-justification. So, I mean, one of the reasons I'm asking this is that Sanford was mentioning over the break that speculative materialism has a huge web following. I have no idea if it's true. I'm not even totally sure what a web following is. Does that mean like hits on the website? What does that mean?
I frankly don't know. It's referred to frequently as a blog-supported philosophical movement to which the philosophers who are credited with being the leaders of the movement tend to refuse to take responsibility for it. Oh, right, I've got a real mic. I should use it. I shouldn't repeat that, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm just asking, is this part of a collective?
I don't know. It's sad not to have somebody who knows what they're talking about on that subject up here.
Let me add to this. The discussion is very much taking these two positions, and we are again in this scenario of function versus form, and versus listing and mapping. And if we look at the work of John Cage, this composition on 20 minutes, you may be familiar with, right? So all the notes are there, and before the interpret, the musician, gets to the note, there's these brackets saying 20 seconds before you could have played that note, and you have 2 minutes to play that note again. You see? It's a system that maps information. You know the composition?
Yeah, I'm trying to understand what you just said. Yeah.
No, because what matters are links. What matters are links, not so much about if he is very much into function and if it's all right, and we have to go into depth. But in the industry of innovation, and this is why, in a very intuitive way, what Alisa is launching on this idea of open. In the industry of research, open innovation is that there isn't a relationship client industry. Open innovation is when everybody shares and is doing this research towards empathy. So it is a system, it's a layout, but it has this freedom. And what matters is, can it be a system? Yes, it is a system. Can it be indeterminate and free? Yes, it can be. And why not to share this win-to-win scenario on this system? So,
Enrique, I'm trying to ask a question from outside the conversation.
Yes.
What is the value of architecture? To whom does it add value, and how do you add value to it?
Exactly.
So I'm just going to be blunt. Patrick, you're a principal in one of the highest income generating offices in the world that took a poor alien woman's crazy paintings on black velvet and turned it into, what is the office, like the third richest in the whatever. You take that and you compare that as a value system, as a way that architecture intersects with global flows of capital, and you compare that to Francois' practice. I don't mean to paint.
Yeah, one day we'll be saying the same thing about poor Françoise.
I will disappoint you tomorrow. It's my favorite game.
I will try to disappoint you.
I'm happy for you. I like to have my poor cousins around. But and then you're looking at Riek's work. I mean, he could be Dutch. I wish there was a Dutch person here, because certainly it's the envy of a lot of young architects today to look at Dutch offices of people who are 40, 50 years old, and to think, how did they do that? And they still don't understand, no matter how many times that they've been told, how much, this is not a free market success of an architectural practice. This is a government subsidized development of design as a global export. So I take it, I take it very personally as somebody who dedicates all that I have, which is my time, because I certainly don't have of anything else, I guarantee you, to this field to try to understand what it means to add value and to whom. I mean, that really,
Let me finish.
yes.
No, it's very good, Sylvia. In the field of innovation is by transparency, this idea of ethics, of transparency, in the field of innovation. And the second is alignment, is to be aligned. That's how you create added value, like economy. I don't see very much my relation to government or to the Dutch industry or country. But to me, these are these two key words: align, to be aligned. This is how Brazil is ending Fame Zero, by government, citizens, firms, private domain, all being aligned. And I know that we have to have a debate and we have to have two positions, but to me what really interests is the added value created out of align, being aligned.
It's a kind. You start? Me.
Sorry,
To the poor architect, not to the
before I
rich
forget this. No. I think there's an interesting challenge.
David against Goliath.
I mean, first of all,
That's what you want, but then we are out of the system. We are out of the game.
the theory of parametricism and the extended theory of architectural purpose is not a theory of the work of Zadid architects. It's a theory of architecture, a general theory, and in particular, the parametricism is a worldwide convergence and powerful movement which includes Greg, Jesse, a whole generation, and new generations like Alyssa, research happening at the AA, at the GSD, in India, in China. That's what I'm trying to theorize, and I want to understand, rationalize, and give the raison d'etre of its unrelenting appeal, the way it draws a whole generation nearly exclusively into its ambit. Every young architect understands that's the only thing to look out for, participate, and work within. And you need to be explained, and the explanation can only be that this has a profundity and pertinence with respect to contemporary society. It's drawing the lessons of 30 years of discursive soul searching and roaming. And we're actually working on this for 15 years within a very, very stable set of values, principles, methodologies, criteria of success, and we're bringing this thing mainstream. And Zadid Architects is one of the first who pushing it into mainstream, who deliver compelling high-performance projects to corporations like BMW, to city extensions in Istanbul, Singapore, and Bilbao, creating what I think the kind of but it's a large movement. It's not only about this one firm. It's not justifying myself. It's justifying everybody in this room nearly. What the AA has been doing, and half of it was all of the GSD are working on, what Columbia University was working on through all of the 90s. That needs to be explicated. That and was that just an enormous kind of exuberant self-indulgence? which begs justification? No, that's the point, and therefore and somebody has to deliver, I think, aggressively and sharply a discourse which brings us home to clients, political bodies, to the discipline itself, to believe in itself in these investments, and I mean that's the challenge, and that's what the theory of parametricism does, what the book does, and it's an open challenge, and it's claiming, in a sense, interpretive authority, and to a certain extent it turns into a normative set of claims, and it's a claim of leadership of the discipline.
Can I say something? Because there was a moment in Enrique's presentation in the last project where you talked about the kind of pixelization, in a way, of both the landscape and the project itself. And you used the term at least 2 times, empathy, that there was an empathic relationship between bodies, something, between you as a designer, your team as a designers, and the client, between the design process and the landscape, between the tree, literally, and energy management of the project in the system. And in a weird way, this goes back to a kind of a taboo injunction, because if you in that project have a relationship with the landscape, with a non-human system, with a non-sanctioned human system, there's a certain kind of information flowing through in that relationship that, in a way, I would relate to just the general level of excess that is available to the designer to work with. And I think parametric design starts to give tools that at least purport to have the resolution that will allow access to control that excess energy, that monstrous, vegetative growth and capacity that certain kinds of ornamentation have. And that came up earlier, in Elise's presentation. There was the question of the tertiary relationship, and you were invoking Charles Peirce. And the way that one layer of information structure and richness would have a second and a third layer laid on top of it, so that there would be interference between those different registers of information, where some, rich information was being inscribed, and interference patterns would emerge. And it seems to me that that could be potentially one criteria by which you would judge whether a project, quote, was successful. I'm not totally buying into that, though, because Sanford's example of the African encounter was initially one of a kind of a set of classes of noise, white noise, pink noise, brown noise, black noise, which then started to come into resolution as he understood that each one of those fields of information was actually highly structured, and there were protocols for the interactions between them. But in that case as well, it's entirely about the distribution of excess energy in the system. And so if I was going to make a point here, aside from offering and inviting you to talk about this idea of empathy, it would be where the relationship is between understanding how much excess energy or capital there is in the system, and how much we as designers have agency to interact with it and channel it. And then finally, what kind of mind, I would argue again, mind emerges. Because I thought in Patrick's presentation there was a very clear argument against, actually, if I read you correctly, against Sanford's point. Sanford was saying that mind is actually a thermodynamic problem, that the management of processing capacity of gray matter and the evolution, essentially, of our organisms is oriented entirely around heat distribution. I've heard him talk about this before. And so it is a properly organic body-oriented question. And your argument was that it's actually a kind of an extended phenotype question, that mind is out there in the system and embedded. And I guess what I would say is, to me, it seems like the question is really what tool or method gives you access to actually start to interact with that excess energy. Because in all the cases, it's all about excess energy. If you don't have that excess capital, you aren't going to have this discussion, you aren't going to have the kind of design projects that we're seeing and that we're talking about.
About empathy, there's this book by Jeremy Rifkin, The Civilization of Empathy. And we've been these 3 years working on this, just to make it short, and that to allow the rest to talk, go for this book and see this research on empathy. Civilization of Empathy by Jeremy Rifkin.
So we want to be ending. Somebody's got to tell me we're done. So can I say good night, or do I need to open to questions from the audience? No questions from the audience. grab anybody who you want to ask a question, get them a drink, put it in their hands, and then use that as the opening to ask them any question that you like. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to the organizers. Thank you to the panel. And
Thank you to the moderator.
Thank you to the moderator. You know, whatever you're supposed to say in Croatia at this point.
Thank you.